Week 5, the third eye, the astral plane, and out of body experiences. The third eye is an esoteric or mystical concept that is basically referring to your mind's eye or the invisible eye, which is associated with the concept of perceiving things beyond the two eyes you have that are visible to the external world. So in tradition of Hinduism, the third eye is associated with the sixth chakra, which is known as the Anja or the brow chakra. The Anja chakra is also known as the Guru chakra, and it is basically the sixth, so the purple chakra between the ears on the image here on the slide. But basically what is special about this is that it is considered to be the subconscious mind that is directly in link with Brahman or the divine in Hindu tradition. So purportedly, as we saw with the Siddhi, through yogic and spiritual practices, one is able through various meditative techniques and exercises to supposedly make the third eye or anja more powerful, therefore enhancing the powers it has. In this sense, the third eye is the gateway or the entryway into the space of consciousness that's known as the inner worlds. So through awakening the body's energy, basically these higher frequencies become accessible to the mind or the mind's eye. And in this act, one becomes capable of accessing these in the metaphorical sense of becoming a traveler between dimensions. So from this notion of the third eye and the inner planes of consciousness, we develop the idea thought-wise in terms of notions of alternate realities, dimensions, the subtle planes, and then spiritual worlds or parallel universes. So in this sense, ultimately where these derive from, there is a strong association with regards to their notion of being connected to levels of consciousness. But in other manifestations, they become associated with actual realities, which may be considered as physical places, but also too, these may be subtle in terms of the subtle body. They may be places in the sense of being subtle places, so energetic places that are not necessarily accessible via matter and movement through time and space, but are actually dimensions that are on different energy wavelengths than our own. So the third eye is basically linked with the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is a small gland in the inner part of the brain that is part of the larger endocrine system. And basically what the endocrine system does is it's a series of glands throughout the body that basically the major parts of the endocrine system match up with the actual, not exactly, but there is a close parallel between the actual chakra locations within the body and the endocrine system in general. So typically these are glands that are responsible for hormone generation. Okay, so they'd be working towards things such as regulating your metabolism, working with growth and development of the body, various tissue functions, your sexual functions, and then affecting more normal aspects of your waking and sleeping consciousness. Okay, so basically these would be things that would determine your mood. All right, and really your perception of the outside world through affecting mood, because ultimately if you think in terms of seeing a particular vision of an event or a day that you may come upon in when you're upset or frustrated or angry versus a day when you start the day you're happy and something has gone well for you, you can see how basically mood really affects your perceptions of the larger reality in total. So through the endocrine system, basically these hormones and hormone producing glands are really responsible for a large portion of basically how we perceive our lives and realities. The pineal gland specifically, it produces melatonin and serotonin, and this is most prominently functioning in modulating your sleep patterns. So the pineal gland itself is approximately the shape of a pine cone. And this is where it actually derives its name from, is this association, which goes back into ancient cultures. As you'll see here in the actual image of the caduceus with the two serpents, at the top of the caduceus is actually a pine cone. And if you have any familiarity with a lot of European aristocratic art, etc., a lot of the motifs that come within that are similar with the pine cone on top of the rod. Obviously, to a certain extent, a phallic symbol, but as we'll see, there are. So one of the oldest associations with the pine cone is its link with what the Sanskrit term is called soma, which is basically a legendary substance that is responsible for offering everlasting life, particularly to the gods. Most traditions have a similar account where there is some kind of legendary substance that basically is what we might call the elixir of life. So in alchemical literature, this comes down to us as the philosopher's stone itself. But many yogis from the Hindu tradition believe that basically this legendary soma substance could be self-generated in the pineal gland. And from there, you could basically, by working with this and developing the pineal gland or the Anja chakra, you'd be able to not only strengthen your spiritual integrity, but you'd also be able to rejuvenate the physical body via a actual healing properties of being able to generate this substance. So the pine cone of the elixir of immortality we also find in the ancient artwork of Mesopotamia, as depicted here with the winged genie who's holding the pine cone over basically the little pail. So in this sense, the pine cone is associated with the third eye or pineal gland again, and then also too, in this usage, the genie is using the little pail, or what we call the bucket of tonic, in his other hand is basically he's dipping the pine cone in there and anointing the king and the sacred tree of life of Mesopotamia with the elixir of immortality. So according to modern understanding, particularly through an article called DMT, the Spiritual Molecule, which came out in 2000, authored by MD Rick Strassman. He basically describes the pineal gland as being responsible for the production of the hallucinogenic chemical DMT, which, if anyone knows anything about a lot of the hallucinogenic drug lore and spiritual associations that come with a lot of plants and substances, okay, this links into this concept that basically there is a connection between the hallucinations generated by these compounds, which are potentially manifested within the human pineal gland in and of itself. So this, by developing this through various forms of meditation, what Strassman suggests is basically that through the human capacity for some kind of mystical practice, that this actual compound is produced in of itself. So this may be explanation as to some of the spiritual phenomena that result in terms of it being a biological chemical reaction or a chemical hormonal reaction in terms of the brain's response to actual stimulus. So according to the European tradition, specifically the medieval European tradition, we get this concept of the witch or the woman who is associated quite often through popular medievalism with Satanism or black magic. And one of the most common themes that we see of the witch is her riding a broom. And you notice here that the broom, basically the witches riding the broom, are naked. So common association would be that the broom is obviously a phallic symbol, so representing the male genitalia, right? So there's something connected with lust, the practice of like non-sacred sexual union with kind of your lower aspect, your lower half, that are common in this depiction of the broom. Contemporary scholarship, though, has come up with basically this connection to the concept of witches flying on brooms and associating it similarly with a biochemical explanation as to what this phenomenon originally meant. So the theory holds that basically bread was a common staple, specifically throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Europe, and bread specifically was made in large part with rye, and a specific fungus grows on the rye known as ergot. And when ergot is consumed, if it's done enough in large enough quantities, it can be lethal to people. But in smaller quantities, it's a hallucinogen. So basically, it's assumed that the association with the broom is that women, through practice, experimenting with various hallucinogenic chemicals that are commonly associated with witchcraft, and accounts of, I guess we could say, persecutory bodies, or people who persecuted witches and investigated their homes and their belongings. There is a history that goes back that would find various of these chemicals like deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake, and jimson weed that are all associated with being hallucinogens and have been found by women that had been, or men that had been identified with witchcraft and the practice of witchcraft. So the link is that because it was associated with being taken, if it was done orally, there was negative side effects to that. So there needed to be another means of absorbing the actual hallucinogenic chemicals. So the theory is that women, instead of ingesting it through the mouth, would apply it to the actual most sensitive of regions where it would absorb most readily. So in the same kind of practice as someone taking your temperature with the thermometer in the buttocks, okay, it's believed that they could apply this under the armpits or in kind of the private part region, because particularly with women, that is obviously a very sensitive area that is very susceptible to absorbing the chemicals much faster than being applied topically to like the skin of the arm, for example. So witchcraft, witch doctors, shamanism, all of these are associations that basically come down to a similar connection with the hallucinogens. Now, in terms of the New Age movement, one of what we might call the leading figures of the New Age spiritual movement is a fellow by the name of Carlos Castaneda. And in 1968, he published his book called The Teachings of Don Juan. Even though this is just the first in a series of books, I believe he had around 11 that eventually he produced, really through probably the 1970s up to the 1990s at the time of his death. But starting out, the first book he actually undertook he started writing it as an anthropology student at UCLA, which is obviously University of California, Los Angeles, right? And where he basically gets into in this research is that he eventually familiarizes himself with a man by the name of Don Juan Matus, who Castaneda claimed was a Yahweh, which is basically a man of knowledge. So in familiarizing himself with him on this assignment to go and interview a Native American with regards to his anthropology work, he eventually becomes interested in a lot of what this man represents, and he eventually becomes an apprentice in the Toltec shamanistic tradition. So Castaneda basically is introduced to Don Juan at an Arizona bus stop, And even though the initial meeting is very brief and non-informative, he is invited to come and see Don Juan at his home in the desert, which eventually he follows up upon. Now, what Castaneda initially asks Don Juan about is about the hallucinogenic plant peyote, because he understands this is a part of the medicine man or the shamanistic practice in terms of various things that might be associated with the spirit world and being able to tap into this other or alternate reality. So eventually, after questioning Don Juan on this, Castaneda is permitted in a ceremony to actually participate ingesting the peyote, and in the vision that subsequently follows this religious act, Castaneda sees a transparent black dog. And basically, after he has this vision and he comes back into himself, Don Juan later tells them that this is basically a powerful supernatural entity. And it's known as the mescalito, which is basically the spiritual aspect of the peyote plant, or really any of the actual hallucinogenics that one can partake of. So in seeing this black dog, Don Juan supposedly interprets this of Castaneda being the chosen one, or someone who is able to receive his teaching. He's been approved by really the spiritual world or the spirit realm. So while under the tutelage of Don Juan, Castaneda is partaking of various other hallucinogens besides just the peyote, such as the magic mushrooms, etc. And through these initial experiences, he begins talking with various desert creatures, such as the coyote. Another strange drug-induced experiences, he actually transforms into a crow and then has the experience of flying high above the mountains. Okay, now when asking Don Juan what is he experiencing in these alternate states and alternate, I guess we could say, perceptions or experiences, basically Don Juan explains to Castaneda that what he's experiencing is a separate reality from the one that we're actually aware of through our waking consciousness in everyday life. So in later books, basically Castaneda is separated from the practice of ingesting hallucinogenics. And Don Juan explains that really it's because he was a beginner and he was not open to this irrational side of existence, that it was necessary for him to basically breach the barriers of perception via the ingestion of such things. But later on, these things don't become necessary when he's actually perceived these as a possibility. So his consciousness is actually opened via peyote, etc. But once that has taken place, that no longer becomes necessary. So from there, the teachings of Don Juan basically begin to focus upon permitting or letting Castaneda access the separate reality upon his own. And to do this, basically, we get into the realm of the world of dreams, which, according to the Aztec Spanish tradition, is known as the Nagul. So basically, Castaneda takes this word, and in his own usage of it, he basically uses it to describe the shaman in general. Early on, he basically describes such appearances as the diablero and those who practice such things. But later on, the more reserved or distinguished title of the Nagul is adapted. So in this sense, it's not only does it just refer to the separate reality of the world of dreams, but it also refers to the shaman who is capable of accessing that separate reality. So for Castaneda, in his book on the art of dreaming, he basically identifies 7 gates or 7 barriers in the process of awakening one's Nagul highest potential. So the book covers the first four aspects or gates of dreaming, which are, you see here on the slide, in white, whereas the blue ones have been inferred by later readers of Castaneda's other texts in determining what the last three may be. But basically the first one is what we might call the stabilization of the dreaming body, which is simply recognizing that you're in a dream via a dream object. So when Castaneda is instructed by Don Juan, he's basically told to, when he is awake, to start practicing looking at his hands. And when he is asleep, to try and look at his hands. So when he is awake, he's constantly saying to himself that I see my hands, I must be dreaming. So when he actually is in the dream sequence, and this takes a very long time for this actually to manifest, so probably potentially a year or a couple of years, eventually he is able to alert himself that he is in the dreaming body, so really attaining a certain degree of lucidity in terms of what we talked about with a lucid dream, being a dreamer aware that they are dreaming. So this is what he means by the stabilization of the dreaming body. The second gate is, once you're aware of that, then you want to shift from one dream object, such as the hands, to another object within your dream and back and forth. And eventually what one is able or supposedly capable of doing is, by focusing upon another object, one can actually almost like jump dreams through that object. So for example, if you're looking at your hands and you look over and you notice that there is a skull on the table, for example, you may all of a sudden leave the landscape of the dream you were currently in when you first noticed the skull, and then that skull transports you into another entirely different dream. So this is what we mean by the dream within the dream. So in this sense, one is able to use the dream objects in order to transport or teleport themselves through various dreams. The third aspect of that is the out-of-body experience, where now what one is capable of observing isn't just a dream object and transporting or teleporting through those, but one is actually capable of seeing their own body within a dream. So it's this concept of separating oneself from their own body and then being able to travel outside of that body within the dream. So this would be most commonly associated with astral traveling, so to speak, which we'll talk about shortly. Now, the fourth aspect is actually being able to travel in other people's dreams. So interesting account, basically, when I was taking a dream course at King's College here in London, there was a local lady who was a guidance counselor, and she had this reoccurring dream of a student that she was appearing at her bed, the foot of her bed at night. The student had been sick and off at school, and so she had gone and was dreaming that she was there and filling her with healing energy. And reportedly, when the student came back to the school, when she was better, she came up to the guidance counselor to visit and said, it's very strange. I had like these series of dreams where I dreamt that you were at the foot of my bed. So kind of a strange phenomenon, but in this, we see this concept of this possibility that some people are capable of traveling it through other people's dreams, if the account is actually a true one. But so when we get into the other three elements, you go from the ability to jump into other people's dreams, the ability to use your dreaming body in everyday life, which basically means your subtle body or your energy body has become so powerful that people are going to start misrecognizing it as an actual physical body. And then this way you could actually start doing things supposedly with your energy body alone. So sixth aspect would be to move the physical body to another location. Okay, so this is almost like this notion that you are not only able to travel to remote places in the subtle realm or the dream world, but you're actually able to have this energy body or the dreaming body go to distant locations, either on this world or otherworldly locations, and actually operate as a being of matter. The seventh one, known as the fire from within, is basically being able to step beyond this world and take intact not only the physical body but also the spiritual body. So basically, it is as if you are transcending matter itself. So in more contemporary Toltec dreaming tradition, Sergio Magna, okay, he is basically been called the new Castaneda, but he is of Mexican origin, and basically he has dedicated his life to trying to find or reamass the lost esoteric teachings of Mexico. And intrinsic to this concept is the notion of Toltec dreaming. And the major part of that is basically the Toltec subtle body conception, which is comprised of two parts. The first one is known as the tonal, which is basically one's perception that is attached to the physical matter in our five senses. So it's associated with the sun, and the reason for this is basically because it is our awareness when we are awake. So it is positioned in time and space, and it's responsible for creating our identity. Just as we saw with the sun sign being linked with consciousness, we kind of see this here again. So the second aspect is known as the Naul, and it is the energy body that basically is that part of the body that travels in the world of slumber. So it's the one, you could call it the dream body, okay? And basically, this is the reason why we perceive things differently in our dreams, because we're operating through a different aspect of our actual subtle person, right? So one of these aspects of the Nahul and its different perception is it allows one to enter into other worlds and also to the land of the dead, which is known as Mictlan. So as indicated by the image here, the tonal or the waking consciousness is typically in the waking state when it's daytime and we're conscious of the actual physical world. The tonal is basically an egg type, almost like Orish, that is focused or situated around the head. So when we sleep, basically the location of this will change with the Nahul, which when we're waking, the Nahul is associated with the area around the navel. Okay, so these are energetic bodies, kind of similar to the concept of a chakra or an aura, really. But basically, when we're asleep, the Nahul basically changes places with the tonal. So really, the Nahul eventually takes over the powers of the head and the mind, whereas the tonal, which is your everyday awareness and waking time, transfers to the navel, right? So when the tonal is overtaken by the Nahul, basically our perception is widened, because in one sense the Nahul is really the subconscious, and it is the actual part or the subtle body that is actually responsible for basically opening the mind up to the larger expanses of subconsciousness, such as the world of dreams. So why does all this matter? Well, basically, someone who is not aware of the tonal and the Nahul, like most people who just do not remember their dreams or pay their dreams no attention, basically, if you continue to live that way and you don't undertake the appropriate training to become aware and able to control your dreams, which being able to control your dreams eventually manifests into being able to control your earthly existence as well. But if you just allow your dreams to continue unaffected, simply ignored, then basically you're going to keep reliving the same mistakes that are going to keep reoccurring in your dreams to you as unfulfilled desires and wishes. So if you are able to transcend that, this is the ultimate goal, right? But the process in this tradition of being in the state of not remembering your dreams is known as being in captivity to the moon's invisible prison. So a moon here being associated with subconscious and the Nahul. Okay, so if you are out of touch with that power, you have not basically raised it, I guess we could say, to consciousness. So you can see here in the religious, we could call it synchronism, which is just a fancy word, which really means kind of this coming together of traditional Mexican culture and the Catholic tradition. We see here the Lady of Guadalupe, and she is standing on top of the moon, which indicates that basically she, in her holiness, has transcended this invisible moon prison. So this is what we see here is kind of the two cultures intermixing into become the hybrid system that Catholicism and the Toltec traditions share within Mexico's peoples. As a testament to this association of the moon and the navel and the nagul, basically the actual word Mexico, it can be translated from its various roots from the ancient language to mean respectively the moon, navel, and place. So if you combine these together, basically Mexico is, or the origins of the word Mexico basically translate as the place of the moon's navel. So in association with this, the ancient peoples of Mexico lived in the land of the dreamers. And basically they are the ones who undertook the training, which were typically the priests and the military caste. So really the upper echelon of the social structure would be those who were associated with being awake while they're dreaming, which we see in connection with the becoming aware of the two dual aspects and interplay of the subtle body. So one of these, I guess we could say, indicators of this tradition are the figures that are typically found upon the various temples of the Aztec peoples, which are known as the chacmul. And basically the figure here is lying on their back holding a reflective mirror, which is basically a reflective bowl in terms of like a scrying bowl, known specifically as the smoking bowl. But notice that the figure's gaze is indirect in terms of observing the mirror. So what this is ultimately suggesting is according to this process of becoming aware of one's nagul energy, then one becomes part of the larger scheme of the tradition of elevating oneself above the prison of the moon to become a nahul, or an active dreamer. So ultimately, this part of becoming an active dreamer is working towards what we would call the blossom dream. And a blossom dream is basically dream consciousness that is lucid. So it's self-aware that someone is in a dream. So when we do this, basically we've worked with the two dual aspects of the tonal and nahul. These come together, and in such a state, okay, basically we're capable of becoming conscious of ourselves dreaming, which basically is a form of power. And from this, just as we saw with Castaneda, there's this concept of transcending just through various dream work techniques. The first one being, according to this tradition, is basically this usage of a mirror and the use of mass. So for 36 days, one is supposed to adopt these masks that are specific to the Toltec tradition, and looking in the mirror, one is to recount their life history for approximately 30 or 36 minutes at a time. And day after day, what basically happens is one's self-consciousness drops from being associated with all of the pain and repressed memories of the past that are basically inhibiting one's living fully. So the key here is basically dropping one's sense of self. So one's capable of doing that by basically becoming detached from the narrative of their life and no longer personally identifying it, hence why you wear the mask. So you see your eyes, but the face is different. So in a sense, you disassociate from this past. And also, too, by donning different masks, then your sense of self becomes much more fluid, which apparently, is linked with this capacity for shape-shifting and be able to take on various different types of animalistic form in dreaming, and then also too in the state of wakefulness when we basically enter into what we might call daydreaming or dreaming while one is awake. So once one has reached this state of consciousness, basically they're able to see reality differently. So then all of a sudden, all of these, we might call them energetic entities, such as ancestors, various spiritual guides, and various entities within the underworld or from the future are now accessible. And I guess they would convey to the Nagul or the shaman instances of the future or truths that may not be accessible to the average person. So basically, with Sergio Magana's variant of Toltec dreaming, what we're ultimately working towards by becoming a master of our dreams is entering the next step, similar to what Castaneda suggests. But in this way, he says, you've reached the next level beyond just simply becoming a master of one's dream, to actually be able to enter the collective dream and the dreams of others. And basically, via that, we are able to influence reality beyond our own minds. So basically, what the shamans are experiencing in, I guess we could say, popular occult terms, contemporary occult terms, would be known as astral projection, when their actual, I guess we could say, astral self or dream body leaves the physical body, or potentially the daydreaming body, right, is capable of leaving the physical body, or when one in a dream is able to separate their consciousness from the dreaming body. So in this sense, the astral projection is a type of what we call an intentional out-of-body experience, or OBE. And what it does is it assumes that the entity that is separating itself from the body is known as the astral body. So when we look back to last week's content with the subtle body, this is the self, but it is the self that is associated with a more refined spiritual essence of the person. So in this sense, it's able to separate itself from the physical body and is capable of traveling not only outside in the world and seeing distant and near places, but also too being able to go throughout the universe and potentially into other dimensions. So in the sense of being a more refined spiritual essence, the astral body in the Western tradition is linked with the rational soul, or what we might call the body of light. So when you're on the astral plane, hypothetically, you are basically in an intermediate world of light, which is between the earthly world and the heavenly region. Now, famous occultists, some British occultists linked with the Golden Dawn group, Dion Fortune, she basically suggests that the difference between a true occultist and someone who's just a tourist or a dabbler is that the dabbler thinks that the astral plane is an objective reality, whereas the true occultist knows that it is basically an aspect of objective imagination. So in this sense, imagination is not meant in the typical sense of fancy or illusion. It has this association that basically imagination is far more important and far more influential than we typically think of when we associate with our common understandings of what imagination is and what dreaming and daydreaming really entail. So basically, in this sense, we're talking about imagination in the sense that the astral plane is not something that is non-existent, okay, but it does mean that basically it is the psychology, right? So it's the realm of psychology in the sense of it is that which basically is some aspect of the self that does have an actual existence, or has an existence that is not necessarily objective in our common everyday understanding, but it's not necessarily either complete fable, which one may associate when thinks of negative uh, thoughts with regards to what we mean by the imaginative. Now, the pre-modern cultures, they seem to have held the imagination and the imaginal realm in a higher regard. And we see this coming down to us through the Islamic philosophers, particularly Avicenna, who basically suggested that the imagination is a mediator, okay, between the human mind and divine reason. So in this sense, right, it has a non-spatial fabric, and it does mediate between the empirical and sensory, but also too it is also the place or the land that is what we might call, in terms of metaphor, particularly through J.R.R. Tolkien, the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings author, is this concept of the Middle Earth. Okay, where does one encounter such entities such as gnomes, dwarfs, and elves? Well, that is in this specific realm of the imagination, which, as we said just prior, is not necessarily just the realm of fancy. It is real in the sense of it is an energetic real that is not associated with the normal understanding of real as in the simple biological material. So when we're talking about astral projection, obviously, as we said, it's a type of out-of-body experience. But in general, this can refer to any experience in which a person is perceiving the world from a location outside their physical body. Usually it involves some kind of floating over the body and being able to observe your actual, I don't want to say, your resting body from a distance, okay? Potentially a corpse, as we'll see. So returning to this conception that we talked about earlier in terms of the biochemical science behind such experiences with the production of DMT, apparently the body, when it's in extraordinary conditions that are what we might call stress situations, such as giving birth or being in a state of sexual ecstasy, okay, even things like a near death or experience or moments of high crisis, DMT production increases, and basically this can have the effect of people having a psychedelic trip, because ultimately the overproduction of DMT leads to hallucinogenic experiences via the mind. And this is not simply just operating in terms of imagining, but these are actually perceived as real by the mind, because obviously the biochemical reactions are causing these actual appearances of such things that we might interpret to be as entities or possible feelings or experiences. So in connection, an NDE, or near-death experience, we can define that as a lucid experience associated with perceived consciousness apart from the body, occurring at the time of actual or threatened imminent death. So in this sense, one is basically, just as they were in the out-of-body experience of astral travel, one is aware of their body, but now it's not the dreaming body, but it's actually the dead body. So this quite often will occur at the scene of accidents. People will basically rise up out of their body and witness themselves at the scene of the accident, lying dead within the car wreckage or out on the asphalt, etc. So the common characteristics of people who are experiencing a near-death experience, if they experience anything at all besides the blackness, often people will hear other people declaring that they've died. Also, too, people have a sense of peacefulness and acceptance, along with the feeling that they're leaving their body and moving potentially through a dark tunnel towards a bright light. Other experiences people have are like having their life flash before their eyes, or what we might call a life review, and then the sense of crossing a boundary or a border. And once that is accomplished, then meeting with other spiritual beings, and potentially deceased friends or relatives may take the place of these spiritual beings. So near-death experience are a fairly common phenomenon. So in a recent Gallup poll, it's estimated approximately 13 million Americans may have experienced a near-death experience. So typically, a third of these people that have done so, the typical after effects uh, I guess, say occur within them is they have a decreased fear of death and also a sense of greater spirituality. So this experience is almost something that has reassured them that death is not the end, that there is something beyond this mortal life. Now, as we said, typically when people are in these high states or high stress situations of death experiences, they not only experience this sense of leaving the body, but they also have this encounter with entities or spiritual entities. And one of those we might call the phenomenon of DEEs, which are divine entity encounters. So in this sense, common to the Western tradition, we might say these are angelic encounters. And what we see with angels, the thing to understand with angels is that the word is from angel in Old English or angel in Old French, and basically they both go back to the ancient root of the word, which is angelos, which is essentially translate as a messenger, envoy, or agent. So typically an angel is representative of some kind of message being delivered in terms of the divine will or the divine wish to the individual who is experiencing the DEE. Versions of angels have been around and predate Judaic Christian conceptions and Islamic conceptions, etc. This concept of otherworldly beings, often depicted with wings, which are associated with air, and this conception of being not material but of a spiritual nature have pre-existed, particularly in the ancient Mediterranean cultures from Babylon, etc. Okay, but really where angels become a focus in the Judeo-Christian tradition is in this concept of the apocalyptic literature, which really is the first couple hundred years BC or before Common Era. So common with this is this understanding that these persecuted communities, particularly Jewish and Christian ones, and the way they interpreted their persecution at the hands of the various empires of the time, being what we might say peoples that had been colonized, overtaken, and a lot of their self-agency had been robbed of them. So their self-understanding was a part of this was built around this notion of a war in heaven, which was occurring at the same time as one on earth. So not only was there persecution and evil that they were experiencing in their personal material lives, but at the same time that they were fighting the various, I guess we could say, empires of the day, such as Greece and Rome, they also believed that there were spiritual powers that were angelic in nature, that basically were fighting the demonic powers that were representative of the energies or the spiritual energies of the empires on the physical earth. So in this sense, a lot of the messianic groups, such as the Essenes that came out of that era of history, are really concerned with basically the war in heaven affecting basically the outcome of what is happening on earth. So in this sense, angel and religious practitioner are united in basically a dual war, one fought in heaven and one fought on the earth itself. So in this concept of the apocalyptic literature and this idea of the war in heaven coinciding with the war on earth, we get this idea that our experiences on earth are basically overlapping with the spiritual realm and that there are angelic interventions. So when we get back to DEEs, basically now not only this conception of persecution and the notion of war in heaven still persists. You can see that in some of the religious fundamentalist depictions in the States where, right, we have this notion of America being the capital on the hill, or God's chosen people, and then any kind of resistance to American hegemony or American, I guess we could say, the way of life, anything that challenges classical Christian morals and religious sensibilities would be considered an aspect of this war, which is actually still being enacted in the hearts and minds of religious practitioners every day, or Americans in general, ultimately. But we see this angelic influence when people get in with experiences of encountering angels. Basically, common responses we see is the sense of being overcome by a sense of comfort, love, and peacefulness. And people, obviously, in times of great stress and danger, such as near-death experiences, feel that there is some form of protection. So if you manage to survive a situation where you had possibly passed or been declared dead and come back, obviously these things are going to be interpreted in a sense, potentially, of someone looking out for you, or there was some kind of intervention on your behalf from the spiritual plane. So in this sense, there's also this notion that we perceive an entity of white or bright light, which may not necessarily have wings, but this is more of like a light figure. And with the arrival of such a figure, this sense of trauma and physical pain is stopped. Okay? And then physical objects that also can appear without any kind of explanation are sent as a message. Perhaps someone who is on the verge of losing consciousness at the scene of an accident sees an ambulance drive by, and on the side of the ambulance there's the symbol of the cross, so they could take that as a religious epiphany, or a moment of some form of intervention or divine, I guess we could say, signaling that they were going to be all right, or that there was some kind of spiritual reality underlying the larger problem that was occurring at the time. So in this place, we see in people kind of the sense that there's some kind of new spiritual or universal shift in their thinking. And typically people who've had these DEEs develop into being more patient, compassionate, and understanding of others through this experience, once again, of sensing that there is some larger purpose to life beyond simply just the everyday pursuits of procuring shelter and food for themselves and their families. So another aspect of entities that I guess we could say people encounter that are not physical in the sense that angelic is a spiritual entity. We also get into the Western occult tradition of something called thought forms. And basically what these are is they're ethereal objects. So once again, a kind of like a finer or a more refined element of a being rather than simply a physical body. And we saw on the actual subtle body last week that basically the etheric body is just that which is emanating as the aura around people, which basically is associated with thoughts and emotions. Okay, but with actual occult practitioners, basically they can utilize this etheric, I guess we could say, subtle energy to actually produce forms through actual creating what we might say are thought concentrations on the astral plane, or via astral projecting into the astral in terms of creating actual entities there, or possible other types of manifestations too. So when we're talking about these thought form entities, the traditional name linked with the Tibetan Sprulpa is known as the Tulpa. And basically, early 20th century theosophists started to believe through magical practice that by willing, I guess we could say, their spiritual or mental powers and focusing upon an entity for long enough, it would actually manifest as an emanation to them. So in this sense, what they're doing is they're manifesting almost like an imaginary friend or some kind of etheric or relatively autonomous and sentient being. So sentient just meaning a thinking and behaving of its own accord being. So it's not just a manifestation in terms of a dream sequence, but this thing actually has some kind of overlap when it comes to the physical world as well. It's not strictly just a mental phenomenon, whether that's energetic or bordering on the physical depends upon the extent of the manifestation. So these things could take on greater degrees of physicality based upon the amount of focus and concentration given to the tulpa. So probably the most famous account of a tulpa with regards to modern Western esoteric history is attributed to the Parisian adventurer, writer, lecturer, researcher, and scholar David Neal, or Alexandria David Neal. And she was basically, I guess we could say, a kindred spirit who was part colonialist explorer and part adventurer slash mystic who went in search of the secret magical traditions, particularly in Tibet. Now, what makes this so extraordinary at the time was the fact that Tibet was largely inaccessible to Westerners at the time. So the fact she is even relating any knowledge, particularly esoteric or hidden knowledge from Tibet, is doubly mysterious in the fact that such a tradition and culture was ultimately closed off to Europeans at the time, when during a time period, if you look, she's operative really 1868 to 1969, so probably late 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s when she is on her eastern journey. But in her explorations there, when she encounters the esoteric lore of Buddhist Tibetan spirituality, she basically is the one who encounters the concept of the tulpa, which she decides that basically she's going to set out and create her own tulpa. So David Neal, in her mind, she basically conceives of an entity figure which was a little monk, kind of like a Friar Tuck clone. It started off being quite friendly and jolly and happy, kind of like little spiritual, almost cherub-like in his nature as to being, well, basically, I guess we could say pleasant in terms of the disposition. So what she basically does is she starts a practice of routinely visualizing him and focusing her attention upon this monk. And eventually she's basically, it kind of starts out as any kind of mental image one tries when they haven't trained their mind to formulate images with any regularity or consistency. The visualization of the monk is not very intense, but if you focus your mind long enough on certain things, sooner or later, if you keep coming back to these visualizations, you'll notice that your capacity for increasing the amount of detail and the vividness of your mental images can increase. So this is basically what she sees with the monk. But when she's creating this tulpa, eventually she starts to interpret this being not just with regards to as a mental image, but soon it starts to take on its own life. And basically it gets to a point where she's increasingly not able to control him, and the monk is actually starting to be seen by other people as coming and going into this realm or plane of existence without any kind of announcement or of arrival or departure. So one of the concerns with tulpas or thought forms are basically, if extended for a lengthy enough of a period, this self-autonomy that the tulpa takes eventually goes out of control of the actual magician who's created the tulpa. So with David Neal, basically the actual monk going from a slightly plump and jolly fellow, good-natured, becomes increasingly sullen, dark, and menacing. to the point where she starts to believe that her only option here is to try and destroy the monk, because ultimately it's become quite a menacing and dark entity. So in order to do that, she needs to try and absorb the tulpa back into her mind to bring it out of the actual physical plane and its ever increasing, I guess we could say, realism. So problematically for David Neal is that the process of actually being able to erase the monk as a thought form takes her over an intense month of concentrating to do so. And basically in this process, it was reported that her health deteriorated. So you can see here that basically this notion that this autonomy of the tulpa is something that gets out of control on her, and is a warning to others who would practice such a similar magical operation. Now, native to Tibet, the tulpa, one of the tulpas that are commonly linked with the Himalayas is the notion of the Yeti, or the abominable snowman. So author Sylvia Brown suggests that basically the abominable snowman is a type of tulpa, and the way this thought form was manifested was via the legend and rumors that had circulated amongst the Sherpas, who are the native, I guess we could say, mountain climbers of the areas, who basically, through rumor and legend, began to manifest this entity within the mountains, and soon it was starting to appear of its own accord and disappear whenever it chose, similar to the monks, with greater, I guess we could say, focus and intensity that the legend took upon the native population, the greater this entity's actual physical / etheric existence took upon. So in this sense, again, we can see that ultimately the power of the mind is capable of manifesting these etheric entities, which seem to be transgressing this distinction between like the etheric non-temporal or non-physical world and then the physical world, so that there's this concern where the powers of the mind are actually able to alter or manifest reality in the physical. In a similar sense, we see this concept, just like the Yeti was manifested via this concept of legend and local hearsay, we get the concept of an egregore, which is basically a group thought form. And what it does is basically it becomes this autonomous entity that almost lives over a group of people, and really ultimately controls people's thinking patterns and conceptualizations of the real, or what reality is and what is possible in terms of what they can do and behave in this reality. So we see specifically with the egregore this concept of like the common purpose. So this could take a view that a family, a church, or a nation state adopts. And these can be either positive or negative, dependent upon what the type of thought is, right? So we could see, okay, if it is a religious association, and that religion is basically exclusionary of other groups, then we could see this taking on a negative manifestation in reality. So at the same time, we see many positive things come out of religion, such as the notion of charity and justice for the poor and the oppressed. So these can be either positive or negative, and even though it is merely a mental construct, the concept of thought form, if we think about its living nature, is very much far more, I guess we could say, influential and real than we typically give to our notions of reality. So when we get into the occult and the esoteric, there is almost this sensationalization of these things, or mystification, in terms of creating like these various conceptualizations that actually have some kind of deeper significance than what we typically just I guess we could say, disavow these concepts with, just based upon our lazy normal patterns of thinking. So in sum, this week we've basically seen that the subtle body we can associate with really the Hindus and the cities as the origin of the notion of interdimensional travel. Now there seems to be links with obviously other cultures such as the Aztec and Toltec one and various European ones that seem to have similar shamanic histories and notions of the spirit world and the shaman as the person who is able to walk between worlds. So in this sense, though, it's also arguable that the Indian traditions, as we said last week, via the influence of the Theosophical Society, have really influenced not only modern esoteric Western groups, but also to the New Age groups such as Castaneda's Toltec shamanism, right? So then also too, there also seems to be this tendency of contemporary, what we might say, secular society to try and explain away such phenomenon via scientific biological explanations, such as DMT and the hallucinogenic substances. So what these phenomena really come down to is the question of imagination and exactly what does imagination entail. And further than this, right, basically how does the imaginal or the etheric astral correspond? So is there some kind of larger or more meaningful phenomenon happening in the capabilities of one's imagination and the powers of the mind, as the occult groups are trying to point us towards thinking? Or is popular conception correct in the sense that this is just mere fancy? So ultimately, this is where the question eventually takes us towards. And what we'll see here in terms of a lot of the various topics that we've looked at this week, in terms of interdimensional travel and various entities associated with such things that we might say as non-temporal or what would we say, corporeal, so in the sense of not having a body, okay? We're going to ultimately start getting into these, because what we'll look at is we'll see this concept of the etheric coming back again and again in terms of the reality of various different types of entities that we're going to explore in the next couple of weeks.